Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. I was at a soiree with my wife Claire. Soiree is a fashionable term for a late happy hour among the intelligentsia, and I was happy because I had a very good scotch in my hand clean. So I sat quietly in the corner and watched my wife and the other people in the room. She was talking animatedly with her mentor and friend, Professor Randy Holcomb. Her hand movements were muffled due to the fact that she had a martini in one hand, but I could tell that she was trying to convey some idea to the professor. To me, he was a cute guy and a womanizer, but I never told her about my personal dislike for this man, because I knew that in return I would only get rebuff. She thought the professor couldn't be bad. Claire was a potential best-selling author. She wrote several short romantic stories that were published and received good reviews for them. In the last 2 years, she has focused on the historical novel and conducted extensive time period research to create a storyline, including political, social, economic, and geographical facts and issues. About 3 months ago, she started writing her book as a full-time author, and I supported her efforts both financially and emotionally. She thought that in the next month or so, she would have enough finished books to send it to a publisher for review. She was still doing research on the book, went to the library a couple of days a week, and met with the professor weekly. I was unhappy that she wasn't at home, especially around him, but I felt I had to trust her without confrontation. My name is Jim Mitchell. I'm 36 years old. I work for an engineering consulting firm in the area. Of course, not the most handsome guy, slightly balding, but I do sports and run, so physically I'm in pretty good shape. I get paid well enough, and I have a professional engineer's certificate, so I have no problem with job security. Claire is 34 years old. She is quite tall, slender, and quite attractive, although not beautiful. I thought that her picture on the flyleaf of the book cover would promote her sale, but I could be biased. She had all the qualities that I always wanted to see in a wife. Pleasant-looking, smart, confident, and loving. Although love has weakened a bit lately, and I attributed it to the long hours she spent working on her novel. She never offered it to me to read, but only gave it to her mentor to read. As a professor of English literature, I thought he understood its merits better than I did, but nevertheless, it was still annoying. Claire and I discussed the issue of children, and she agreed that one day she would want to have them, but first she wanted to establish herself as an author, so I waited patiently for the book to be finished, but I began to have doubts about the fact that time was passing and there was no end in sight. I hoped that when this novel was over, she would be ready to get on with her life, because obviously her biological clock was ticking. We were both only children, and our parents began to worry because there were no grandchildren yet. If it takes another 2 or 3 years before she's ready to have children, they may never become grandparents, I thought. The event, this evening, was hosted by the Dean of the School of Art, and I was here solely for Claire's sake. I didn't mind such events, but they weren't my favorites. In college, in my freshman year, I had to take English literature as an elective, but the subjects preceding engineering were prioritized over this subject, and I'm afraid I didn't learn much, enough to get a C. The conversation here, as usual, focused on the latest book and the hottest new author, which was not on my list of personal entertainment. I knew enough listening to Claire, but in this environment, I was not at ease. When we first arrived, Claire and I went around the premises and shook hands with most of the 20 or so people. As I said, I was now sitting quietly in the corner with my whiskey, watching what was happening in the room, enjoying the view of my wife among her colleagues and thinking about how great it would be if her novel became a bestseller. As long as she has 2 small books on her account, she can meet and communicate with people here on almost equal terms, but a bestseller would put her much higher than them, and she could revel in their envy and jealousy. She wasn't usually a very outspoken person, but she was human, and being admired by colleagues would give her confidence in herself and her abilities. I chuckled to myself, thinking about all the work she had done and all the possibilities and scenarios that might arise if her novel went all the way. At that moment, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye and saw Mrs. Holcomb, the professor's wife, approaching me. I groaned inwardly, because I hoped that I would be able to sit quietly, not communicating with anyone, but it turned out that this was not going to happen. Mrs. Holcomb was a matron with whom I spoke briefly several times, but I did not know her well. "Jim, I noticed that you were sitting here alone. and I told myself that it would never help a person to have fun at one of these meetings. It will give such events a bad name, she joked, sitting down on the chair next to mine. You've got me, Mrs. Holcomb. Can I get you a drink? Call me Jean, and I can't take alcohol, but I can see that you're enjoying yours. I've always maintained that a little scotch keeps flies away, Jean. So what do you think about your wife's book? Randy says he thinks she's definitely going to be a bestseller. I think he's a little jealous. I was not offered it for reading, so I cannot comment on the quality of the writing or the content. Well, I haven't read it either, but Randy is impressed. Does your wife even discuss this book with you? Not a word. I'm starting to think that she doesn't think that I have anything to say about this and what she would like to hear about. However, I am very proud of her for taking up the novel and, judging by your words, she did it very well. All this time, I was watching Claire and the professor, who were still talking on the other side of the room. They had been talking together for some time. As I continued to watch, they seemed to come to an agreement, and Claire looked around the room. I assumed she was looking for me, and when she noticed me, she started waving her hand, and then she must have noticed Jean next to me. With what I could interpret as a worried look, she turned to the professor and said something to him. He looked in our direction and also looked at us strangely. Then they both hurried in our direction without saying a word. As they approached us, I wondered what could have alerted them. Jean must have been watching them too, because she commented on their actions. It looks like we've done something to worry our spouses. It looks like it. Jokingly, I added, maybe they think we're planning an affair. Jean smiled faintly at my inept remark. Upon reaching us, our spouses immediately began a nervous dialogue with us. Hey, you two, what are you planning? You see, I told you so. I laughed at Gina. What did you tell her? Claire asked. I told her that you two probably thought we were planning an affair. I grinned at them. Both Randy and my wife seemed to turn a little pale, but Randy came to his senses first. Well, it did look a little suspicious, and we wanted to make sure you two were behaving yourself, he grinned with a grimace. Jean asked, have you solved all the problems with Claire's book? It seemed like you talked her to death. Oh, yes, Randy replied. However, Claire's book doesn't have that many problems. It is on the right track and should receive a good response when it is published. This concludes the conversation. We chatted nervously together for a few more minutes, and then the professor turned to Jean. I suggest we take a little walk, dear, and leave the two of them alone. I have a busy day tomorrow. Jean stood up and turned to me. Thanks for the conversation, Jim. We'll do it again sometime. Great, Jean, it was nice, I replied, turning to Claire, who was still standing in silence. Do you want to chat too, or are you ready? I asked. I think we can go. It's been a long day and I'm tired. I got up, and after saying goodbye to the host and hostess, we went home. On the way home, Claire was silent while I drove, which gave me time to think about the reaction she and the professor showed when they saw Jean and me talking together. Normally, it wouldn't have occurred to me that I couldn't trust Claire, but something seemed wrong, and I thought that a further conversation with Jean might clarify something. I decided to follow up on this next week. On Wednesday morning, I managed to get through a bunch of problems at work and called Jean to make an appointment for lunch. She sensed that there was something strange in the couple's reaction to our meeting in the evening, and readily agreed to meet me for lunch the next day to talk about it. We met at the O'Carly restaurant on the highway, as we are unlikely to run into our spouses or anyone who knows us there. First we had lunch, and then we started talking. You must have some problems if you called this meeting, she told me. I think so, but I'm not sure what to do next. Well, I also have some concerns, and they are stronger than yours. That's why I agreed to this meeting. She continued to explain. A couple of years ago, I caught my husband having an affair with a graduate student, and he swore that he would never do it again. I think he had relationships with other female students before that, but I had no proof. This time, I will get proof if he is related to your wife, and I will expose him. I'd like to suggest hiring a private investigator and splitting the costs. According to my information, it can be very expensive, and by dividing the costs, we can find out if anything is going on. I also suggest that the detective only keep an eye on my husband. If he is having an affair with someone other than your wife, or not at all, I will pay the expenses myself. If your wife is involved, we'll split the costs. Does that sound fair? I thought for a moment. Yes, I can agree. When do you want to do this? Right now. Are you free at 3 o'clock this afternoon? I have an appointment with an investigator who was recommended to me by a friend who had a similar problem. Okay, give me the address and I'll meet you. I have to get back to work. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we met at the investigator's office, explained to him what we wanted, gave him the necessary information about our spouses, and Jean first left him a deposit. He told us that he would report to Jean on a weekly basis, unless he needed to contact her sooner. We both took a deep breath as we left his office. We were ready, and now we just had to sit and wait. That was the second most difficult thing we had to do. The most difficult thing will be to behave normally around our spouses. As the week dragged on, I waited to hear from Jean, knowing it would probably be a whole week before we knew anything, as I tried to keep from confronting Claire with my suspicions. She behaved like a normal, loving wife, except that our lives continued with low frequency. As before, when she seemed ready for bed, it was difficult for me to develop the passion and libido that it required. Finally, the following Wednesday, Jean called and invited me to drive up to the investigator's office for the first report. When he entered the office, he invited us to sit down and took out a report from a stack of others on his desk. I know you're anxious to know what we've found out about Professor Holcomb's activities, and I'm sorry to report that your suspicions are correct. Professor Holcomb is having an affair with another woman. We followed him to the Best Western Motel in Ginsburg on Thursday and yesterday and met a young woman there. They went into different rooms each time, but both times it was the same woman. I have photos here of them coming in and out of rooms. He pushed the photos across the table to us, and I took one of them with a trembling hand. When I looked at her, I saw that the professor was leaving the motel room behind a woman who turned around and looked at him. I couldn't make out her face, but her height, hair color, and styling were similar to Claire's. Grabbing another photo, the woman was looking in the direction of the camera, and I realized that it was not Claire, but a younger woman. With a sigh of relief, I leaned back in my chair. I must have been very tense, because my body seemed to go limp at rest, and my head hung down for a moment, freeing myself from the anxiety that I had been experiencing for more than a week. Lifting my head, I looked at Jean, who was looking through the photos one by one in determined, gloomy silence. When she finished looking through them all, she turned to the investigator. Can you get proof that they are actually engaged in fornication in that room? Well, we could get the photos, but you won't be able to use them as evidence of adultery in court because it would be a violation of their privacy. If they were doing it in your house, you could use the photos taken there. Your husband may understand this and not take her there. Why don't you talk to a lawyer who specializes in divorce and get his recommendations? I think I'll do that. Please keep watching until I ask you to stop, Jean said, gathered up the photos and got up to leave. We left the investigator's office and headed to our cars without talking for several minutes. I'm going to send you a check for half of this week's surveillance, I told her. You don't have to do this. I'm very sorry that you found out that your husband was probably unfaithful, but I found out that he wasn't doing it with my wife. It's worth a lot to me, and to help pay for it is cheaper than any price. So I'll write out a check and mail it to you. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. We broke up, and I headed home. It was only after I had driven for a few minutes that it dawned on me. Why were the professor and Claire so embarrassed that Jean and I were talking together at the party? We still haven't solved this mystery, and there must be something we don't know about. Claire may be having an affair with the professor, but a week's surveillance hasn't spotted them yet. I was suddenly glad that Jean had instructed the investigator to continue monitoring. I should call her and tell her what I'm thinking, so she doesn't stop working without telling me. It was strange that in all my conversations with Jean, we never came across anything that remotely indicated a common factor indicating any careless actions on the part of Claire. Another week passed, and we met with the investigator again. This time, there were the same photos with the same girl. The investigator found out that she was another graduate student, and Jean decided to file for divorce on the basis of irreconcilable differences, since the lawyer told her that we live in a state where there is no guilt, so the discovery of evidence of adultery will not affect the outcome of the trial. The marital property will be divided 50-50ths. He will pay maintenance, since Jean does not work, but there will be no alimony, since their children are already adults. I wrote her a check for half the cost of the surveillance, and we broke up. I still didn't know why our spouses were acting so upset at the party, But now I was sure that Claire wasn't having an affair with the professor. But what happened? I needed to find out, and hiring investigators to monitor the spouses was expensive. So maybe I should set up the surveillance myself. I need to think about it. Lately, our lives have slowed down significantly, and I thought that if everything was normal and I didn't suspect that she was playing, then I would comment on it to her. I decided to say something that wouldn't make her suspect that I had trust issues with her, but might calm her conscience if she had one. That evening, after dinner, I talked about my problems. Honey, is something wrong with you? Are you feeling all right? I asked her. I feel good. Why are you asking? She replied, frowning in mild annoyance. Because you've been giving me a lot of excuses lately that you don't want to make love, and I thought maybe you weren't feeling very well. Maybe you should see a doctor. She turned a little pale for a second, and I felt a little euphoric that I had managed to get through to her conscience. No, I feel good, I told you. But I didn't notice that I was avoiding you. I'll try to be better to be with you. But I've spent so much effort on the book to prepare something to send to the publisher that lately I just can't focus on anything else. I understand, honey. You know how much I love you and am proud of you. So I'm worried about you. Making love should be good for relaxation, and I'm always ready to help you relax. I smiled at her. She smiled back at me slightly. Let's see. And then she came over and kissed me lightly on the lips. Taking my hand, she led me into our bedroom and began to undress. I watched her for a minute and started undressing too. It was surreal. My libido was aroused, of course, but I didn't have the feeling that she was making love with all her heart. It seemed like she was just doing it to please me, or more precisely, to shut up and calm her conscience. She reacted correctly, it seemed to me, but when we finished, I didn't have the feeling that she was satisfied. An empty feeling remained in my chest. After I got off her, she went to the bathroom to clean herself up, and then came back, said good night, honey, and lay down with her back to me. There were no hugs, as we usually did after bed, and I realized that everything had changed. The next morning, I left the house for work at the usual time, and Claire was still in bed. After driving away from home, I stopped the car and called the office on my mobile phone to inform them that I would not be there that day, and then went to the car rental agency located nearby. On a day like this, Claire usually went to the library to continue her research. After renting a car, I returned to our street and parked where I could watch our house from afar. At about 9 o'clock, I saw Claire drive out of the garage and walk away from me towards the university library. I fell in some distance behind her. She drove right up to the library, and while I was parking, she left the car and entered the building. I was a few minutes behind her, but I knew where she was doing most of her research, and I found her there when she was getting ready to view the microfiche. Hiding behind the next stack, I could keep an eye on it, pretending that I was interested in a large reference book. Half an hour later, another woman joined Claire, and when Claire saw her, she stood up and they hugged. What surprised me was that they kissed lightly on the lips in greeting. Now I was completely confused, but I kept watching. Claire returned to her seat behind the microfiche, and the other woman took a book out of her bag and began to read, as if delaying time. Claire continued to work for another hour before she signaled that she was done for the day and began collecting notes and personal belongings. Once I had to go to the toilet, fearing that they would leave while I was gone, but the time was right and I didn't miss anything. As she stood up to leave, the other woman also began to pack. Before leaving, they kissed again and, holding hands, left the building. When they reached the parking lot, they split up and went to their cars. I lingered on the back landing until they started moving, and then slipped in behind them as they both headed in the same direction, which was the opposite direction to our house. They didn't seem to notice me when I followed them, as I kept a respectful distance behind them. The traffic was heavy, there were few traffic lights, but we were not driving in the direction of our house. About 20 minutes later, they drove into the apartment complex and parked. After getting out of the car, they went to one of the buildings, and I settled down to wait. About 2 hours later, I saw Claire leave the apartment, get into her car, and drive away from the parking lot. I followed her again until I was sure she was heading home, then went to have a bite to eat and think about what I saw. What was going on? Who was this woman? Did Claire have a lesbian affair with her? And finally, how do I get answers to my questions? While I was eating, my thoughts were a little confused, but it all came down to whether I should hire an investigator to get answers or do it myself. In the end, I decided that I would try to get the information on my own. So after finishing lunch, I went to the nearest Radio Shack store and bought 3 battery-powered and sound-activated micro-audio recorders. They were quite expensive, but I decided it was cheaper than hiring an investigator. By the time I bought everything, it was already close to my usual time to get home from work, so I headed to the car rental shop and took my own car. When Claire arrived home, she greeted me with a kiss and hug. "Darling, get yourself cleaned up and make yourself a drink. Dinner will be ready in about half an hour," she told me, heading back to the kitchen. After making a drink, I went to the kitchen. "How was your day?" I asked. "It's fine. I did quite a lot of work in the library in the morning, and after lunch I worked on a book. As usual, I think. Have you heard of anyone? Have you heard from Mom that they are going to come to visit?" "No, it was a quiet day. I didn't talk to anyone. If I hadn't been aware, I would have accepted what she told me without question. She didn't blink when she was talking and telling me lies. In the past, I thought I could trust her with my life, but now, that trust may disappear. Our whole marriage now seemed to be built on lies and possible infidelity, even if it was with a woman." I went back to the living room before saying anything. "When I come across her, I'll need all the facts. How was your day?" "What is it?" she asked, entering the living room. "As usual. I was out of the office most of the day, working on a project. I mentioned it in case she called the office and was looking for me. Dinner is ready. If you want, sit down." While we were eating, she informed me that she would meet Professor Holcomb in his office the next day to discuss the last chapter of her book. She was almost ready to send the package to the publisher, and she was overcome with excitement. I just nodded and said that I keep my fingers crossed for her. After dinner, I cleaned the dishes in the kitchen, and she went to her room to work on a book. When I was done, I took one of the dictaphones to the garage and installed it under the driver's seat of her car. I've made sure it's hidden, but it's easy to get at. Then I took another recorder and installed it in the lining of her purse. I held the third recorder to set it up in her room in case she called from there. After that, I watched TV until about 10 and knocked on the door of her cubicle. "Honey, I'm going to bed to read a little. Are you coming soon? I want to finish this chapter so I can take it to Professor Holcomb tomorrow, so I can stay late. I'll join you as soon as I can." "Okay," I said and went to bed. I read for a while, but I couldn't stay awake and fell asleep. I do not know what time she went to bed, as I was fast asleep. The next morning, when I left the house for work, she was still sound asleep. I was going to let the recording devices keep an eye on me so I wouldn't have to stop working for a while. When I returned home that evening, I waited until dinner was over and she went to her room, then went out to the garage and checked the recorder in her car. I wasn't surprised that he was practically empty when it came to talking. Then I found her purse and listened to the voice recorder, which I hid inside, using headphones. And again, nothing special. I listened to her conversation with Professor Holcomb about her book. They didn't seem to be interested in anything else. So I reset the recording and put it back in place. I'll have to wait to check the recorder in her room. This evening was a repeat of the previous one, and I ended it by going to bed alone again. I woke up early the next morning and slipped into her cubicle to pick up the last recorder. There was an interesting but short one-sided conversation in this recorder. First, I heard the number dial, which meant that Claire was calling. "Hi, it's me." I heard my wife's voice. "Is everything still in force tomorrow?" I didn't hear the voice on the other end very well, but it seemed to be a woman. "Yes, I'm looking forward to it too, but I'm a little worried. Jim is acting a little weird. I wonder if he suspects anything?" "No, I'm not going to leave him yet. Thanks for the offer. I need to give this part of the book to the publisher and get a commitment from them before I decide to leave it. I still need his support for a while. I will be glad when we can fully be together. These attempts twice a week hardly satisfy me. I'm glad I can see you for a few hours tomorrow. It was hard trying to be intimate with Jim just so that he would be a little satisfied. I really don't enjoy it as much as I enjoy being with you." "Okay, I love you too. I'll see you at the library tomorrow." I was stunned. Everything became clear to me what she was doing and what her plans were. I thought I loved this woman, and she loved me back. And now it turns out that she's just using me to feed, clothe, and keep me at home while she writes her book and indulges in lesbian affairs. How little I knew this woman, after all the years of our marriage. I hurriedly reset the recording and hid the recorder again, and then went to work, completely shocked by the revelations about her betrayal. I sat in the fog for about an hour at work, and then decided that I needed to get unbiased advice on how to continue living with my marriage. Obviously, he was doomed to divorce, but I needed to protect myself financially before that happened. I got the name of a divorce lawyer from a friend who had just gone through a difficult divorce, called and made an appointment for the next morning. I wanted to listen to the dictaphones again and see if I could collect more data to pass it on to the lawyer. That evening, I found out that the dictaphone from her purse was the final reason for the divorce. The recording started in the library, as it seemed to me, for a short time. Okay, I'm almost done. All I have to do is pack my things, and we can go to your apartment. God, I need you so much, I heard Claire say. Another female voice answered, let's hurry up, it's late, and you want to be home on time. Then everything was quiet until it started again. They must have been in another woman's apartment. Hurry up, take off your clothes. It sounded like Claire. It became quiet again, then suddenly, don't stop, don't stop. This went on for quite a long time. Then everything stopped, as they were obviously getting dressed, and then silence fell. I decided that I had enough information, so I didn't hide the dictaphones. Instead, I made 3 copies of the relevant content. I hid 2 sets in my briefcase and packed the third one to take to the lawyer. I went to bed without telling Claire. It wasn't my usual practice, and it might have alerted her that there was a problem, but I didn't care anymore. I had to wait until I talked to my lawyer tomorrow before I got into a confrontation with Claire. It took me a while to fall asleep, and as I lay there, I wondered how Jean Holcomb was doing with the divorce. The episode at the dinner party certainly opened my eyes, but I was still puzzled as to why the affair between Claire and the professor had not yet been revealed. I fell asleep again before Claire came to bed. The next morning I came to work, and after talking to the boss, I went to the lawyer. His secretary took me to his office immediately upon arrival, and I spent about 15 minutes explaining the situation with my wife. I also let him listen to my recordings of her conversations with her lover. When I finished, he asked me a few questions. This book that your wife is working on, do you know if it will be sold? I have never read it, but my wife collaborated on it with Professor Holcomb from the English department at the university, and as far as I understand, he is delighted with it. Now she's sending the first few chapters and the outline of the storyline to the publisher, and I think that will give her an idea of whether she will have a book that will sell. Were you her only support while she was working on the book? Yes, a couple of years ago she quit a good job to work on a book full-time, and all this time I gave her 100% support, financially and, I think, emotionally. What do you want from this? Do you want a divorce, separation, or do you see the possibility of reconciliation after some time of consultation? I'm going to get a divorce, and I want to make it as hard as possible for her after I heard what she told her lover. I was thinking about destroying her book by destroying her computer and all her scientific records. I would not recommend doing this. In my opinion, it may give you pleasure when you're done, but you may miss the opportunity to take more revenge. What do you mean? I asked. If the book has a good chance of selling, even if it becomes a bestseller, then in case of divorce, you will be able to claim half of its proceeds from the sale. I think this will provide you with a decent revenge and will be very beneficial for you. If you had destroyed all her works, she could have restored them in a few months, and you wouldn't have gotten anything out of it. It's worth considering, of course, but maybe it's not such a full-fledged revenge. Well, you have to consider that it may cost you several $100,000. While she can rebuild her romance in less than 6 months, you can end up getting very little out of it. What do you suggest? I would advise you to wait and see what the reaction to her book will be from the publisher. If she asks for and receives an advance from the publisher, it's a sign that they see great potential in the book. If the advance is significant, she can immediately move in with her lover. If she does, you can proceed with the divorce. There is no fault in our state, so we will use irreconcilable differences as a basis and file a claim for a share of the profits from the book. You can use adultery as the reason, but it won't affect the outcome and will probably be much more expensive. If selling a book brings her income, you probably won't have to pay the upkeep. Also, you say that she had a well-paid job before she quit to work on her book. It will also work in your favor regarding the content. Looks like I have a lot to think about. Could you give me a day to think it over and then come back to you? No problem. Just call me and let me know. I left the lawyer's office and went back to work. For the rest of the day, I didn't have time to do much, thinking about my options. I really wanted to hurt her in some way for using me, but I didn't want to jeopardize getting a financial share from the sale of her book. Then I remembered something about Claire's parents. They were fundamental Christians and would not have been sympathetic to the fact that their daughter had a lesbian affair and committed adultery. If there was any way to use this as revenge, I would get great satisfaction after everything is over. An idea popped into my head. On my way home from work, I stopped by Radio Shack again and bought another surveillance item. At home, Claire and I had dinner prepared by her. She told me that she would send the package to the publisher the next day, but did not expect a response for at least a month. She also mentioned that she had heard that Professor Holcomb's wife was divorcing him because she had caught him with another woman, and it would cost him very dearly. I smiled to myself and made a remark that I saw Claire didn't like. That's what happens when you play. I know I'd like to get back at it if it happened to me. She paled and quickly regrouped. Why do you think this is going to happen to you? Do you think I can play with you? What is it? She asked defiantly. Now, honey, I know that you are a faithful wife as much as possible. It's just that spouses cheating on each other annoy me, and I start to get angry. You know, I'm sure you'd never do that to me, and I'd never do that to you. She quickly changed the subject. Don't forget that it's garbage night, and there are several bags of things in the garage that need to be sorted for recycling. Okay, I'll take care of it. Then she disappeared into her office, and I didn't see her again that evening. While she was in the study, I installed a motion-activated mini camera in our bedroom and a large-capacity voice recorder that I bought at Radio Shack that day. I connected it to the home wiring so I wouldn't have to worry about changing the batteries. It also had the ability to record audio. When I checked it, it was working fine, but I left it off until I put the second part of my plan into action. The next morning, I got up and left before she woke up and had breakfast at Denny's. When I got to work, I called my lawyer and asked him to postpone the divorce until we found out if the book would be published. He told me it would be the wisest thing to do. That evening, I told Claire that I was leaving next week for a 3-day business trip. Later, listening to the tape recorder, I heard her telling her lover, whose name was Eileen Carter and who, as I found out, was divorced, about my business trip. She suggested that Eileen come and spend 3 days at our house, and they could live together while she continues to work on her book. Eileen agreed, and the second part of my plan fell into place. The next week I packed up and went on a business trip, but it was just a short trip to a city 40 miles away, where I stayed at a motel with a good restaurant. Before I left, I talked to my boss and my secretary that I would be gone for a few days, and if my wife called, just tell her that I was out of town. They seemed to know that something was wrong in my marriage and agreed to help me. I called Claire on my cell phone every night so she wouldn't suspect anything, and just stayed close to my hotel room because I didn't want to take any chances, although it was unlikely that I would run into someone who knows me. It's been a boring 3 days. 3 days later, I returned home and behaved as if I had just been on the other side of the country. When I returned, Claire was already waiting for me with dinner ready. After kissing her like a sister, I asked about her book. Have you heard anything about your book? Oh no, it's too early. They just got it. I think it will be another 2 to 4 weeks before I hear anything. Are you worried? Yes, of course. I can barely sleep at night thinking about how this will be received. I've been trying to contact Professor Holcomb, but he's not answering his phone. I wanted to talk to him about some of the issues that I have, but probably because of his wife and the university, he has a lot on his mind. Why is the university persecuting him? I asked. I heard that it was because the other woman he was dating was a student, and the university has a very strict policy regarding communication between staff and students. He could get fired, and I wouldn't want that. I think he deserves everything he gets, I told her. Aren't you being too cruel? What is it? She asked, pouting. I have already told you about my position regarding cheaters. I have no compassion when it comes to cheating, I told her harshly. She looked a little shocked, but continued anyway. Well, if one of the partners cannot provide for the needs of the other, I think he or she should have the right to meet those needs elsewhere. Do you really believe that? But what about the marriage vow to leave all others? How about talking to another partner to see if something can be done? How about a consultation before you run to someone else? While we're on the subject, could you tell me if I'm meeting your needs? Before answering, She hesitated and replied with a sad expression on her face. "Jim, you satisfy me more than any man." Then she turned around, entered her office, and closed the door. I didn't want to push her any further, as I wasn't ready to confront her yet, so I didn't say anything more. Maybe I got to it. I don't know. I didn't think it made any difference now. I checked the recorder and the mini cameras and, as I had hoped, found them in our bed. The conversation was similar to previous conversations I had heard, so now I could sit and wait. For the next 3 weeks, we entered a waiting period. Everything is frozen in anticipation of news about the book. It seemed like we were just coexisting together, each doing his own thing. We made love a couple of times. Finally, one day I came home from work, and Claire was all excited. Guess what? I got a call from the publisher today. They really liked my book, and they are sending me an advance of $25,000. I'm so excited. They also recommended that I find an agent and gave me the names of several people they had already worked with. I've been talking to them on the phone all day, and I think I've found someone I like. That's good, honey. I'm very happy for you. You've worked hard on this, and you deserve some return. Do you want to go out to dinner tonight in honor of that? I was just going to suggest it. Let me go change my clothes. We went to one of the best restaurants in the city, and then returned home and made love. She seemed a little more taken with him than usual, and I was pleasantly exhausted when we finished cuddling up and falling asleep together. My last thought was to call my lawyer in the morning and start filing for a divorce. When she got her hands on the advance check, I realized that I was in trouble. The next morning at work, I called my lawyer, and he said that he would immediately prepare the documents and submit them the next day. The next day, she will be served. That morning, before leaving the house, I recorded several DVDs with Claire and her lover in our bed and sent one to the lawyer. I was going to wait a bit before doing anything with the others. I also took a couple of days off to make the necessary changes to our shared bank accounts, credit cards, finances, insurance, retirement security, as well as my will and retirement plans. Claire was still asleep after another late night reading when I left the house. She was supposed to be at home all day, and in the morning she was supposed to be handed the documents. The documents were for a divorce based on irreconcilable differences and a 50-50 division of the entire estate, including future income from her book. At my request, a photo from the DVD was included in the package of documents, in which she was captured in bed with her lover. I wanted her to understand why I was seeking a divorce when she received these documents. Around 11 a.m., she called me. She spoke very calmly. "I see you figured me out. Your package has arrived, Jim, and I'm sorry our marriage ended like this. I'm going to go to a lawyer and fight you for a share in my book. By the time you get back from work, I'll be out of here. My lawyer tells me that I have a very good chance of getting a share in the book, but you can talk to your lawyer about this. Goodbye, Claire. I think all future contacts should be with our lawyers, so have a happy life." I hung up before she could answer. Now there was one more thing left for me to do, and that was to happen after the divorce. I had to send a copy of the DVD to her parents. It was just a small sign of revenge, in addition to any monetary gain I hoped to get from her book. The epilogue. It took about 6 months for our divorce to be finalized. There were a lot of negotiations between lawyers, but in the end, I received 40% of the proceeds from her book, as I funded and supported her through most of her research and writing. As a result, I received more than $250,000 for my share. Since the book hit the bestseller list and even within a month, it occupied the first place in sales. Professor Holcomb was exposed by his wife, and despite the fact that he had a position, the university forced him to resign. Otherwise, they would publicize his indiscretion. He agreed and resigned. It's been a year since the divorce, and I was having lunch alone at a local restaurant when I heard a familiar voice. "May I join you?" I looked up and saw Claire standing there, looking at me expectantly. She looked very attractive and well-dressed. Exactly how I would expect to see the author of a best-selling book. Standing up, I invited her to sit down. "How are you, Claire? It's been a while, and you look really good." "I'm fine. I'm working on a new novel," she grinned. "And this time, I'm not planning on sharing any of this with you." Laughing, I replied, "I have no doubt that he will be a great success." It was funny that I could be calm with my ex-wife now that the emotional turmoil that was part of our divorce was long over. "So how are you doing? Has there been any new romantic interest in your life?" No, just casual dates, but nothing serious. I'm in no hurry to jump into the fire again. What about yourself? She paled a little at my remark, but continued with a smile. I'm single, just like you. No romantic interests. What happened to Eileen? I thought she and same-sex relationships were your thing. She didn't seem to really want to answer, but after a pause, she confessed something to me. My affair with Eileen lasted only a few months. The novelty and excitement seemed to have evaporated, and we broke up. Since then, I haven't had another woman. I must admit that, looking back, I understand what I gave up when we broke up, and I am very sorry that everything turned out this way. I guess I'm sorry too, but trust is so easy to lose and so hard to regain. I think I'm still mad at you for sending that DVD to my parents. They are just now coming to their senses and starting to talk to me again. I guess I just wanted revenge for the way you played with me. I've often wondered that, she said. How did you know about my indiscretion with Eileen? It bothered me a lot, because I tried not to let you know about it until the book became a reality. I thought for a moment to remember the moment when I first suspected something, and still felt puzzled when I answered. Do you remember that party at the dean's house? I think it was a couple of years ago, during the Christmas holidays. Yes, I do, but I don't remember anything I did there that concerned Eileen. Then I told her about my feelings about the professor being a womanizer, about the conversation with the professor's wife, Jean, and about her and the professor's reaction to the fact that we were talking together. This reaction, combined with the fact that Jean had already caught the professor having an earlier affair, made us suspect that there was something more beautiful in their reaction to our meeting than mentoring for a book. And we thought that for some reason they didn't want us to talk together. Claire looked at him in surprise before answering. As far as I remember, we reacted this way because Randy and I had been talking for some time and had forgotten about you too. It happened because we were suddenly overcome with guilt for neglecting you. We weren't involved in a relationship, and we certainly weren't worried about you hanging out together. Anyway, I told her, since we misinterpreted this reaction, we went and hired an investigator who discovered the professor's affair with a student, but did not discover that you and he were related. Afterwards, since I still had my suspicions, I hid some dictaphones and captured your affair with Eileen. So it was your and the professor's innocent reaction to Jean and me talking together that led to the disclosure of 2 affairs and the breakup of 2 marriages. How strange.